Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode in the series New Language Learning and Teaching Environments. Today, here with another one of our wonderful authors, Fabiana Fazzi. Welcome, Fabiana.
Hi, hello everyone. Very excited to be here.
Yes, and this is the first time that you and I have actually met on the video camera. We've obviously been communicating about your book throughout the process and so on. But this is the first time we have the pleasure of actually meeting each other. And that's one of the purposes of recording these short videos, is that not only you and I, but also readers of your book and other books in the series can just get a little bit of an idea of who is the editor, who is the author, who are these people, and just learn a little bit more about the project. So today we're going to be talking about Fabiana's wonderful book, Museums as Sites of Transformative Foreign Language Learning Beyond the Classroom, which came out a few months ago. And we'd just like to hear a little bit more about this really, really interesting topic. But before we do that, Fabiana, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you based? What do you do?
So currently I'm based in Padua, which is a city in northern Italy, very close to Venice. And I actually work as a researcher at Ca' Foscari University in Venice. It's a very exciting city, very exciting university, full of museums, which is one of the reasons that kind of brought me to write about this topic. And I work quite a lot on multiliteracy, pedagogy, language learning beyond the classroom, CLIL. And I'm kind of in hybrid sort of profile because I work as a researcher, but I also do lots of teacher training. And sometimes I also work as a language specialist or a museum educator. So I deal with quite a lot of different institutions as well, not just at university, which is another thing that kind of brought me to write about the book.
Yeah, and well, let's jump straight into the topic, because museums is obviously such an interesting area. I actually showed your book to my wife, and I said to her I was going to be speaking with you, and she is not in our field. She's not a teacher, and she's not into applied linguistics. But I showed it to her, and she was like, "Wow, that's so interesting. I've never seen that before." Now, you've briefly mentioned a little bit about your interest in learning beyond the classroom and so on. And you obviously live in a wonderful city for museums, but I'm still curious to learn a little bit more about what it is specifically for you about museums. There are lots of interesting spaces where language learning and perhaps teaching could take place, but why specifically museums?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that museums are full of objects of very different types. You have artworks, you got specimens, depending on which museum you go to, and each object kind of can lead you to talk about different themes. So there's always something new to discover. You have to do a lot of research on the collection to see what kind of themes you can talk about, how to connect each object, and then the kind of activities that you can do are kind of very different in a way from the ones that you can do in the classroom, because you have the object right in front of you, so you can sit around it, or maybe if it's something that has also sounds, you can listen to it. So also the sorts of dynamic that happens in the museum is quite different. And then it's always a new place. When we welcome students to the museum, it's not the usual classroom where they spend most of the time. It's always a new environment. It's multisensorial, so there are noises, there are smells, other people. So it's always very rich in inputs as well. And then it's so you get to talk to your peers or to your teacher, to the museum guy in a more informal sort of atmosphere. So most of the time happens is that you also get to know parts of the person that you have in front of you that you haven't really seen before. This creates sort of new social bonds.
A lot of very interesting things there. The social component, the multisensorial aspect. I'm also wondering about, the embodied aspect. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days about education just basically limiting, especially younger learners, to sitting in what is essentially a very unnatural environment for a
Yeah.
very long period of time, which obviously is very tricky for everyone, but especially as it turns out for young boys who, but of course also girls. But there's a lot of research that points out to all the deleterious effects of just having to sit still and concentrate. And in a museum, of course, you might not be running around literally, but you walk around and there's different places you can go. You go into rooms and you interact with different objects. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, you're walking and you're seeing a lot of things, and then you're talking to each other, and then everyone, I don't know, because I've been a museum educator, so I've also seen it firsthand. You also get very different perceptions from the object, and this kind of leads you to want to discuss it with the others. Of course, if you create the situation to do that.
You mentioned also in one of your chapters the concept of museums as third spaces. Now, for some listeners, that might be a new term. So very briefly, can you explain to us what that means?
So basically, kind of seeing museums as spaces where different cultures, different languages also come to interact and create new perspectives about the objects. So this is especially thinking about, for example, students that visit the museum that have a migratory background and they're doing an activity around an object where they're trying to kind of, understand, interpret it. And in doing this sort of interpretation, all their funds of knowledge, all their languages kind of come into play. And there is this interaction trying to sort out different meanings. And this is something that is facilitated by the materiality of the museum, but also the kind of social activity that happens around this materiality. So this was kind of the idea of a third space, which sometimes it's difficult to create in the classroom because of the materials that maybe you don't have, or maybe because you focused on topics that are part of the national curriculum and you tend not to get outside of this sort of box that you're in, while the museum kind of opens up to different themes as well. So you start talking about one thing
Very nice.
and then it leads you to something else.
Right. Yes. Well, like in the real world, because that's one of the things that I like about the use of these types of spaces, and museums are perfect for this, as in some ways maybe quite unusual for a lot of learners' spaces. Depending on the learners and their backgrounds and their families, they may or may not regularly go to museums. But it is, of course, in some ways a very authentic situation, in the sense that you have an experience at an individual level, whether you like an artwork or you don't like it or you hate it, doesn't matter. But there's something visceral and real about that experience, which, again, as you say, is perhaps sometimes difficult to create in a classroom, right?
I mean, it's not impossible, but then, in the museum is kind of easier in a way. I mean, I just remember we were with a group of other students in an ethnographic museum, and there was this Japanese sculpture that represented a sport. And we started by observing the sculpture and describing it. And then slowly we started talking about sports in each country. So, I mean, we stayed in front of the sculpture for like half an hour. And there was obviously a lot of scaffolding going on as well, trying to find the words to say what they were trying to say in the second language. But it was a very interesting conversation because we all learned from each other. So also the hierarchy, sort of the power relation kind of changes. So there's not the teacher and the students, but it's more of a communal space where everyone kind of says, what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and they put it on the floor to discuss it.
Yeah, very nice. And also, of course, there may be times when a learner, a student, may know something about an artwork or country that is depicted there, may have visited, like in your example, Japan, and you may not have, and suddenly they have something interesting to tell you. And so I can see how that might open up all sorts of new ways of communicating. Now, in your book, you have a number of case studies without describing each of the case studies, but just very briefly, just tell us, what are these case studies for? What's their purpose in the book?
So the first one is actually taken from my PhD thesis, and it's about CLIL programs for secondary students, so from 11 to 18 years old, more or less, in Venice, in three different museums, both art museums and science museums. And in that case, I wanted to investigate what kind of impact the museum activities would have on students' perceived learning outcomes and attitudes towards English as the foreign language. So with that case study, I kind of wanted to, delve a little bit deeper into the potential of doing museum activities with this age range and in English, of course, and also investigate the methodology. So in that chapter with that case study, I talk a lot about also how to integrate museum-based and language-based pedagogies, trying to find the right balance between cognitive and linguistic load. I also spend a lot of time thinking about that it's not just about the language. I mean, when you're in the museum, there is also content to be learned. And so I talk a lot about CLIL as well, and how you need to kind of adapt it to the museum because the context is totally different. You don't have the same time that you have at school. The sort of interaction that you create around the materials is different, and so on. And the second case study instead, with adult migrants learning Italian as a second language and visiting the Peggy Guggenheim collection, which is one of the most renowned contemporary museums in Venice. And there I concentrate quite a lot on the intercultural and also affective affordances of visiting museums, and how, however, you have this sort of benefits only if you design the activity in a certain way. So both the first and the second case studies are kind of the base of the pedagogical framework that then you have in the last chapter, which is very practical. It takes educators step by step in creating similar programs. And then the third case study instead delves more into how students, when I say students, I mean people of different ages that are taking some sort of second or foreign language course. So how students can also become designers of meaning. So how at the end of a museum program, like a school museum module, they can also create new narratives, new digital narratives. And in that case study, I look specifically at creating city tours with an application that is called Easy Travel. And so I analyze a little bit the potential of also transforming students in designers of new narratives. And this is also something that is,
Wow.
and this is also something that is particularly important in the pedagogical framework that I present in the last chapter, just because there is this idea, usually that students just take part in the activities, but they're kind of passively, participating in the activities, while I always encourage educators to think of how can students then interpret these meanings and create something new.
Yeah, very nice. Lots of practical ideas in the book as well, not just the theory, but also examples from your own experience and practical suggestions as well. So just want to finish off with a couple of maybe slightly more personal questions. One is, like, what are you hoping that people who read this book will get out of it?
I mean, in a way, if people haven't really thought about this, I would kind of like to encourage them to try and to create activities, like inspired maybe by the ones that I present in the book. And this is kind of aiming more at museum educators, for example. They're trying to make their institutions more inclusive, or maybe, trying out new sort of experiences. For language teachers, is mostly about kind of integrating what they do in the classroom with something, exciting, with something new outside. Maybe even looking at the institutions they have around the school, the classroom, in a different way, trying to collaborate with professionals, or anyway professionals that are outside of their institution. And for researchers, is mostly, kind of trying to contribute to all this talk about multiliteracy pedagogy, but also, language learning beyond the classroom, where it happens, how it happens. So when writing the book, I thought a lot about how I would like to analyze the sort of interaction that happens in the museum, which is a bit difficult because of the noises, because of the context itself, but seeing how we co-construct learning together in different environments. I think that's very exciting, and it's something that that researchers could be interested in exploring more.
So now that you have finished this book, what's next for you? What are you working on next?
So at the moment, I'm actually working on a European project which aims at integrating environmental humanities and language learning pedagogies. So we're piloting units where we try to foster environmental literacy and English language learning in secondary students. So we're creating these pedagogical units, which have climate fiction, but also outdoor experiences. And so the idea now is to kind of see what happens during the pilot, and how we can actually train language teachers to also become ecological teachers in a way.
Wow, we'll look forward to receiving another book from you at some point in the future for the series, I hope. and
Yeah,
and
don't
also
worry.
to everybody listening, the series is open to proposals. I just created a short video the other day. I'll put the link in the description with a little bit more information about the series and its aims and scope, etc. But yeah, I hope that everyone listening, like Fabiana, if you have a good idea that you'd like to share with the world, that you consider the book series, we're definitely interested in hearing your ideas. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you Fabiana for joining us and for your wonderful book.
Thank you so much for inviting me.